Thank you, Caroline. I appreciate that. Nice to see everybody again. Hello. We are going to do something a little bit different. You've heard some of my comments already this morning, but we'll try to have an interactive conversation. So if you have questions during the session, please just raise your hand. Maybe we'll toss the ball to you, midstream. We don't have slides. This is going to be not a tech-heavy presentation. But what I thought we would explore is explore this concept, the conflict and the synergies between privacy and sustainability. And I'm joined by Matthias Mattheisen. And for those of you who've been in the ad tech industry for a while, is he on? Is he there? Okay. Oh, there he is. I see him. Matthias spent many years with the IAB Europe and was instrumental in helping the IAB Europe to create and implement the transparency and consent framework here in the EU. And he is now the director of privacy at TripleLift. So Matthias, welcome. Happy you're here. Oh, we can't hear you.
Oh.
Try again.
Hello.
Say hello.
No.
Yeah, now we can hear you.
All right. I said I'm sorry I couldn't make it in person, but this is better than nothing. So I'm glad you'll have me.
Yeah, I said to Matthias, he asked earlier if I would be able to roll him around the stage with me. And I said, I don't think it's that kind of setup, but
With the remote control little robot, that'd be cool.
Exactly, that would be cool.
Now I'm Big Brother, which is maybe also fitting.
Yeah. So today we're going to kind of explore the ad tech industry's privacy journey from kind of voluntary standards, which organizations like the NAI helped put in place, to full-fledged regulation. We'll talk a little bit about the public policy framework, but you heard a lot about that yesterday from Cornelius and from Lartice in the US. And then we're going to talk about the use of data for new uses and the potential effect of the industry's effort to protect privacy on sustainable business practices. And so we'll hope to save some time at the end for questions, but if you have questions as we go through, please feel free to do that as well. So ad tech companies, this has been my life for the last, since 2015, so that's 8 years, facing lots of global compliance challenges on privacy. Obviously, we heard a lot yesterday about the myriad or the onslaught of privacy regulation that has been enacted globally, and especially I come from the US, and so the onslaught of the 14 different state laws that are forcing companies to think about compliance strategies, not just globally, but individually within our own states, has been very difficult. And so you heard a lot about those yesterday, but I'll just give you one example of how companies are challenged to create global compliance management programs in this kind of disconnected regulatory world. So for example, the United States has a California law. We talked about that yesterday, the California Consumer Privacy Act. And it requires companies to provide an opportunity for consumers to opt out of the sale of their data. We still are struggling to understand what sale means in many aspects. And it similarly requires notice and an opportunity to opt out of the use of a consumer or a person, I like to call them people, sensitive data. But recently we had a law enacted in Washington called the My Health, My Data Act, and that requires companies to obtain consent for the collection and sharing of sensitive data. Not to mention that the two definitions are not the same, right? So one state requires an express notice and an opt-out. The other state, which has a different definition of what sensitive health information, requires you to have opt-in. So companies that are struggling, that really want to use information responsibly are really struggling with how to implement this. And there's 14 different states, and then there's all of the world. So obviously for companies trying to create these global compliance programs, the complexities are huge. So Matthias is responsible at his company for implementing those global compliance programs. So Matthias, you're tasked with understanding these regulations, as we know, distilling them into a compliance program, that minimizes risk, but also, and this is something I think we don't talk a lot about, allows companies to achieve their goals, the goals of showing ads to people in a responsible way. So Matthias, what are your, I don't know, let's just say top 3 challenges in figuring this out? And we'll tie this all into sustainability on the back end.
I think you mentioned the biggest one is the proliferation of requirements, particularly in the U.S., but not only, like Canada, Quebec, with a regional law that has just taken effect is also obviously something we need to think about. So that's an information problem, gathering all the requirements, figuring out what it is that we need to do, understanding these is not easy because of the sheer scale of the amounts of laws that we need to keep track of. And then figuring out, outside of sort of these, user experience questions and opt-outs and opt-ins, but even just the processes that we need to implement for privacy or data protection impact assessments, for vendor management, for all these various things that are happening under the hood that are not super flashy and cool to talk about, but how to scale those or even create a scalable process in the first place is really difficult if you have all these various laws and you have varying level of understanding about them. And then lastly, I think the market dynamics have changed recently or the last few years, and I think the culture around privacy also is a little bit more challenging. With deprecation of third-party cookies, there are sort of pressures now to consider approaches to continue providing the types of services that this industry has been able to provide to advertisers, and that maybe we wouldn't have found as palatable in the past. And we need to look at these with a new mind as reality changes, and look to achieve, I'd say, at least parity with the controls that have existed in the past, but on newer technology and arguably sometimes more intrusive ways of doing things. I think that's very challenging too.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, and the recognition. And I was thinking about this in the very first session we had yesterday, how helpful it was to understand the things that you have to do in order to take an ad out of a chatbot, right? And then whether or not the information that ends up resulting is the information that the user is looking for. Kind of hard to tell, but it's challenging to think about these new technologies and how we institute rules and laws that don't necessarily keep up with those technologies. I think we're often much faster than the politicians, but our technology develops at a much faster rate. So I think you spoke a lot about all of those things that you have to do, and I think, as I mentioned earlier, prioritization of all of these different tasks is going to dictate the order of solutions. And employing kind of smart data strategies is really only the first step in complying with all these requirements. So I think we talked a little bit earlier about understanding the activities and impacts of your business partners, of the technologies you implement, you just mentioned that, Matthias, and industry practices to fully integrate impactful changes to protect consumers. And it's not easy, given how complex our ecosystem is. And ultimately, everything that we do to protect privacy is going to impact our efforts to achieve the sustainability goals that we talked about this morning. Matthias, how are you thinking about and managing kind of the data flows with your business partners? If business partners and downstream data flows are part of the privacy conversation, they're certainly also part of the sustainability conversations. Are we, sending and receiving the right signals that properly reflect choice? Can we simplify these systems? And how does that help or hinder our efforts to provide a more sustainable business? That's a lot all in once, sorry.
Yes, but that's fine. So I think over time, the signals that we need and the signals that we're therefore developing are becoming more complex rather than less complex. And I think the amount of, let's say, privacy metadata about that contains information that is relevant for us to make the right decisions is getting more rather than less. So if we just think about like TC strings, the transparency and consent framework signals that we're using a lot in Europe, they contain information about what information has been given to a person accessing a website, what choices may they have exercised, and beyond that, what was the publisher's wish with respect to what each of the companies that has a little signal in there is allowed to do. And so over time, we really started out with something rather simple, and then meeting the needs of publishers and different strategies on how to comply with the law and so on. We've made these initial signals a lot more complex, so they're now sizable, and then we're sending them around billions of times a day, and because they relate to potentially consents that each company processing personal data of somebody needs to be able to demonstrate they had if somebody were to ask. We're storing a lot more data over time too. And now sometimes it can result in less data being shared amongst the industry participants, and therefore less data to be stored by somebody else potentially. Or you maybe see you have a signal you aren't allowed to do a certain thing, and therefore you don't store the data at all. So I think overall, we probably are processing more data in order to comply with privacy regulation, but that is not to say that sometimes it results in less data processing, data storage, and so on, on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, because when I kind of wrote this proposal and was thinking about the intersection of sustainability and privacy, I was convinced that privacy efforts and sustainability efforts were complementary and compatible. When Matthias and I were kind of preparing for this panel, he suggested quite the opposite. And so in many cases, because of the stuff that Matthias talked about, the storage, the processing, the extra things that we have to keep in order to prove that we've complied with privacy laws, is actually taking up more energy and more, more carbon emissions, more stuff. So I think it's really interesting, because there are some things we can do that helps our sustainability goals, but it can also hinder them. And I think that just demonstrates the difficulty of the problem that companies are facing. Companies that really want to do the right thing, and I'm convinced at least companies in my membership are really trying to do the right thing. It's a challenge, and there's in the US we have a term called whack-a-mole. Does anybody know the whack-a-mole game in carnivals, right? So you push down on one thing, but it pops up in a different place, and it's truly a challenge for folks like Matthias and I as we're trying to do these things. So, but I think impactful strategies that are pragmatic and meaningfully contribute to kind of a virtuous cycle that I talked about earlier. There are some, and I'd like to kind of talk through those. Keep collecting and using data indiscriminately. I'm speaking to the choir here, but it's just no longer sustainable. It's not sustainable from a privacy perspective, but it's also not sustainable from an environmental perspective. And so we have to change. So one thing I'd like folks to think about and consider are data retention periods. So this is something I talk about with my member companies all the time. Data doesn't, I think I mentioned that this morning. When I worked at AOL, the folks would say to me, well, why do we have to delete data? There might be a use for it 2 years from now. We want to keep that data. But data doesn't have to be and shouldn't be kept forever. When companies ask me, or when folks in my company ask me that question, I ask them the question back, what is the longest purchase cycle in online advertising? Does anybody know what it is? Anyone want to take a guess? Matthias, do you know what it is? It's auto intenders. So when you start to do research for a car, and it's a very big purchase for many of us, or those of us who have cars, right? And so it takes quite a long time. So the purchase funnel for somebody who might be interested in purchasing a car, and data that would indicate that a person is interested in purchasing a car, it's about 120 days. That's not very long. If you want to keep data for 2 years, what are you going to do with it in 2 years? I've already bought the wedding shoes. I've already purchased the car. So we really need to think about this. The vast majority of goods and services that are advertised on the internet, the purchase cycle is less than 30 days. So maybe we should think about, again, changing the conversation, having shorter data retention periods. The other thing I want companies to think a lot more about is selective data collection strategies. So focusing on purpose. For what purpose? And these are simple questions, right? But they're questions that as we get into our dev cycles and as we think through all these things, they're really kind of lost. What is the purpose for which we're collecting the data? And I'll use an example from a non-online example, but I'll use an example from my various travels in Europe. 9 times out of 10, even post-GDPR, I've complained about this to Matthias many times, the hotel that I check into will ask me for my passport and will then take a photocopy of my passport. And they want to do that, and I ask them the reason, and they say it's to identify you. We have to make sure you're the person who signed up for this hotel room and whatever. And even more so today, or this week when I checked into my hotel in Amsterdam, they sent me an online request to enter my passport information. The number, the expiration date, everything on my passport. That's pretty sensitive personal information. And when I did it because I wanted to check in more conveniently and more quickly, and I asked them on check-in, why do you need that data? And they said, well, we just want to identify you and make sure you're the person that you are. In the US, and I know you guys like to think that we don't care about people, but we do. In the US, they want to find out that I am the person that is checking into this hotel room. They ask me for my driver's license, they look at it and they look at me, and then they give it back to me. They don't retain that information. So what purpose are you collecting the data for? And then use it for that purpose and not anything else. And if you don't need to store it or keep it, and you just want to use it in an instant to send a person an advert, fine. So I feel like small shifts in data strategy and by asking these questions is going to help decrease data center usage, help decrease our carbon footprint, et cetera. But Matthias has a different view. He thinks that there are many things that we're doing to comply with our privacy laws that hinder our sustainability efforts. You talked about some of them, Matthias. But I don't know if you wanted to add more about kind of the...
Even on data minimization, it could be that we're applying encryption and doing other sort of more complex things on top of what we're doing. That is, in data protection terms, a minimization effort, but not really in an environmental sustainability point of view.
Right. Yeah, and the consent flows that you have to take, for example, we're talking a lot in the United States about age verification, right? So children's appropriate design codes. So we should identify those sites that are directed to children. We should make sure that children are not going to the other sites. But in many times that requires the collection of data about a person's age. And that is hindering to privacy. And if we're storing it, hindering to sustainability. So I think what we need to look to are kind of pragmatic solutions. And I'll use, I'm doing this for Dura, who might be downstairs. Oh, no, there she is. She said, we were at a discussion at a lovely Women in Tech breakfast that eyeo hosted in Cannes. And we were talking about ways that there are simple, straightforward solutions to sustainability. And one of the examples that we talked about was plastic bags in grocery stores. So grocery stores incentivize the use of reusable bags by either charging for plastic bags, which I did here in Amsterdam, or removing them altogether. You have to bring your own bag in order to use it. Did it affect grocery store revenue? No, we still all bought the same groceries. We just changed our own behavior. And so I think like that, we need to change the behavior of ad technology companies without negatively affecting kind of this vibrant and essential advertising ecosystem that we've brought, because I think it does bring benefits to consumers and to publishers, and most importantly to small businesses. We spoke a little bit during a coffee break about big publishers and small publishers, and how small publishers really need advertising, and those small publishers are important to our conversation, even our conversations about democracy, which we're having a lot in the US. So practical policy approaches take away the plastic bags. Let's figure out how to do that in ad tech. We'll find a way through. So here we are. Let's talk about sustainability a little bit and kind of what our lessons are. I think it's pretty complex, our path forward. So Matthias, can you talk a little bit about how your data strategies are with respect to sustainability? Are you guys implementing sustainability practices? Are you being required to do so by your advertisers? What's the story on sustainability at TripleLift?
I think we're early stages. I think advertisers are starting to take more of an interest. It hasn't, frankly, come into like my wheelhouse in privacy yet. I haven't been asked to think about a measure that I'm proposing from a data protection or privacy point of view, again, because there are environmental considerations to be balanced. So, I think we're still at the early stage where we need to gather information and we need to agree on what the standards even ought to be. What are we measuring success against? And that probably is quite difficult. And I think in those early stages in particular, I think coming together as an industry and even before there is any regulation, setting out some initial goals to get on that first step of the stairs so that we can incrementally increase what we're doing is sort of where we're at.
Yeah, and so this is a good segue into kind of one of my favorite topics, which is self-regulation. So the NAI has instituted self-regulation for privacy for the last 23 years. I think there's a couple of lessons that we can take away from that. So before the onslaught of regulation in privacy and data protection, there were voluntary self-regulatory standards like those promulgated by the NAI. It's kind of hard, a lot of folks will say, well, now you have laws, and so therefore self-regulation didn't work. I'd really hate to see the state of our industry today if those standards hadn't been in place. So you can think about how much worse it might be. So you can say it wasn't wholly successful, but you can also say, well, where would we be without it? So I think, a self-regulatory approach to sustainability is possible. I think there's a number of things, and Matthias knows, that we have to think about. So the approach can be successful if you have adoption, if you have scale. So we have 100 member companies at the NAI. They comprise approximately 95% of the ad tech ecosystem. There's 5% of the companies that are not complying with our self-regulatory standards. And those companies are doing some pretty bad stuff. So if you don't have the entirety of the industry, I think there's an economic factor that companies, if there's economic viability in doing the wrong thing, there will always be players that will do the wrong thing. I think industry powers can press their thumb on the scale of adoption. We talked about this a little bit earlier. I think it's incumbent upon advertisers to think boldly and to require, Matthias, once we get if there are self-regulatory standards, if we can agree on measurement, I think it's going to be incumbent upon the advertisers to force that through the ecosystem. I think it's interesting, though, because advertisers will also work in their own best interest. So with respect to privacy, we're responsible for implementing privacy laws, but advertisers want to know that you clicked on that ad, and they want to know that it's you, and they want to know what kind of purchase you made as a result of that ad or what you did afterwards. And so, so it's not just the technologies that are compelling this, it's the fact that the data exists to show it. And then regulation will compel compliance. I think that's a clear answer. Matthias, anything
if there is enforcement.
I'm sorry?
If there is enforcement, regulation will compel compliance, which is, just on this topic. Europe always said we have the strongest environmental standards in the world. And then where did consumers get screwed when the cars didn't meet those requirements? It was here. So. It's not just what you write on paper, but what you're willing to enforce.
I think that's a very good point, and we're facing that in the United States as well. So companies are saying, yeah, you know, California has a really strong privacy law, but I'm not really seeing a whole lot of risk in my company's activities being looked at by a California regulator. They're worried about Google, and Google has a line item for fines, right? And I'm not trying to diss Google. They're a great partner of ours, but for smaller companies that are flying under the radar, I think enforcement is really important, and without that, there are going to be challenges. So let's do some takeaways, Matthias. We have 25 seconds left. So I think the takeaways are ask hard questions about your data strategies and really simple questions. Use less data, fewer vendors. We talked about that a little bit with Justin this morning and the bid density. I think thinking through your messaging, this is something, again, we mentioned earlier that we can have a whole entire panel on brand safety and on privacy as a brand safety value. But I think if marketers are marketing to their business partners, that they can find any person, anywhere, anytime, and serve them with the right ad, but they're marketing to people and saying, we protect your privacy, neither of those messages are credible. And so we have to think with our marketing teams about how to embrace privacy as a brand safety value and showcase the work that you all are doing to protect privacy in the world. And then engage policymakers. Matthias, I know this is a big one of yours. Educate them and talk to them. I think pragmatic approaches are only available if they understand our industry. Matthias, anything you want to add on kind of policymaker engagement?
I would even say that before we go to the policymakers, we should talk amongst ourselves, and we would figure out what it is that we can achieve ourselves, and then maybe talk to policymakers with some constructive suggestions, right? I think what is really dangerous, where we maybe have gotten into a little bit too much in privacy, is, oh, this is going too far, we don't like it. Like, let's be proactive in telling them what we think works.
I think that sounds great, and I think that should be the last of our advice. We're happy to take questions, but I would encourage you to change through action and to adopt the words of Claire this morning. Be bold. So thank you very much. Happy to take questions. And Matthias, you'll stay on, right, to take questions?
I have another call. I'm kidding. I'm here for you.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for this interactive presentation. So do we have any questions?
There's one there.
Nora already made the call. She's on her way. We have time. It's fine.
Thanks so much, both, for the interesting insights. I had a question, Leigh. You mentioned a lot self-regulation and also, the response from policymakers. And in my experience, they tend to be very skeptical, at least on this side of the pond, and say, yeah, you don't figure it out properly yourself, and we put a hard law on top of you, which brings the right incentives. And I guess with sustainability, this is even bigger, because there are a lot of concerns about greenwashing and not trusting industry to do the right thing. So I'm just wondering, A, if you encounter this similarly, and B, how you respond to policymakers when it comes to these concerns?
Yeah, I think it's that's a very good question. Thank you, Cornelius. I would note that most of the laws that have been enacted around privacy and data protection have as their source the basic foundational principles of self-regulatory organizations, right? So notice, choice, accountability, control, a lot of those basic fundamental principles that we established in self-regulation years ago are part of those laws. And so I think the foundational basis is solid. I think what companies will, or what regulators would say is, yeah, but your companies don't follow them. So I think what's important to note is, one, scale and adoption. So as I said, we have 100 companies. Those companies are doing the right thing. The other 100 or so companies in the ad tech ecosystem that aren't doing the right thing are spoiling. The bad apple spoils the whole bunch. I also think that enforcement is a very key component, just like it is with real regulation. And so figuring out how we can self-regulate and enforce those standards, I think, are really important. And finally, I think that if if regulators would embrace, and I know this is a big concept in the EU, would embrace the self-regulation as a way of helping regulators regulate, so co-regulation, if you will. This is something we've talked to the FTC about a lot. And if they would endorse, they love the data location standards that the NAI just put out for companies that collect and use location data for advertising. But they won't endorse it publicly, right? It's hard to get regulators to do that. But if they did, more of our companies would embrace it because they would know that they're safe from the regulator standpoint. So I think there's a back and forth there that we should really work on to make co-regulation kind of stronger than voluntary self-regulation. That would be my answer, and would be my answer for sustainability too. Matthias, would you have anything to add?
So sort of lift all boats up at the same time really shouldn't be underestimated. And I think that could actually really help regulators with enforcing requirements. But often laws are not so specific to a particular industry that you can just go and implement them. You need to interpret them and figure out where to, where to set your sort of more business requirements based on those laws. Not always, but in data protection, that's certainly the case. And I think industry organizations have a really important role there. And if regulators could act almost like a catalyst for industry to come together and figure these things out, then the job of regulators should be significantly easier. And not to mention, industry organizations can move a lot quicker with the support of regulators than if regulators are sort of discouraging cooperation and good practice by regulators by going after what they're doing, right? Like that ultimately undermines industry's best efforts and prevents them from maybe getting to the best place sooner rather than later, if at all.
Okay, I think I saw a hand raise over here, right? Just go via some middlemen. There we go.
Good catches. I'm not convinced I would be able to catch that thing, so that's why I've not asked questions.
We can try after that. So regarding the data retention period, it's not always up to the company how many years it should keep the documents, because for example, the country I'm living in currently, the law demands 10 years of retention. Then the regulator should be educated or be involved in the sustainability process or policies you want to make. So
yeah, I agree with you completely, and I think that demonstrates like the challenge of trying to, you have to comply, so you have to keep your data for 10 years even if you don't need it for 10 years, which also creates sustainability issues. It's a really difficult and challenging environment to operate in, and I think educating lawmakers, which is one thing we try to do a lot, at least at our organization, about ways that we can work together on these things might be easier, right? That's the first step. It's just a difficult step. I mean, I know at least in the US, educating the current lawmakers on Capitol Hill is almost impossible. They don't really want to hear it because they have their own political agenda, right? Which is a challenge.
true.
Yeah, sounds a bit like running up a downhill escalator.
Running up and down the hill all the
constantly.
time, yeah.
Yeah, that's a bit of a battle.
With a full bucket of water.
Okay, then I would suggest take your questions maybe with you, because we will take a quick break here because my stomach is telling me
Yes,
get
it is time for
food and
lunch.
get it now. And yeah, that's exactly what we're gonna do. And I would ask you to be back in about an hour, 1:30. We continue here, and yeah, bon appétit. See you later.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.